There we go. Do you want to say hi?
Hi.
Do you want to explain why I'm a little late today?
Well, we were playing a game, and there was this part, and there was a clown bathroom.
Why did you have the cloud bathroom?
There was a tree in the middle of a pathway to get to a bathroom.
Mm-hmm. Was there anything else, like a confetti thing?
The confetti field and jumping cows.
Yes, there were jumping cows jumping through the confetti field.
And a path full of princesses.
That's right. Anything else?
Well,
Was there a house?
there was a house with pillars in it.
Why did you put pillars? Pillars don't go in a house.
I just did.
No, pillars don't go in a house. We have to delete the pillars. Oh, sorry. You okay?
No, we can't delete the pillars.
That is true.
Because then we will delete the ride.
That's right. So, any other rides you put out?
Well, I had the 3 roller coaster, and it was so scary.
Were there trees on it?
Yeah, and there was another roller coaster that was so scary.
Mm-hmm. What color was it?
I can't remember.
Do you remember the 3
I think
one?
it was orange, and it was yellow.
That's right.
There was this orange ride that we keep going around and around, and we went backwards too.
Mm-hmm. That's the water one, right?
Yeah.
Did we put any other rides out today?
Yeah.
What's the last one we put out today?
Well, I can't remember.
So it's 3 colors.
That was already what I talked about.
Oh, that's true. You did already mention that one. But you didn't mention that it's 3 rides in one, did you? Because what you do is you go down red.
And then you go down orange, and then you go down yellow. And it was so much scary inside.
It was fun, though, wasn't it?
Yep.
You, as ever, make a wonderful theme park, my dear. High five, in case you didn't see that. Oh, all right, kiddo. There's only one thing left to do. Merciless tickling.
You can't tickle me.
That's right. Can you explain why I can't tickle you?
Because I promised.
No, because I promised, remember?
Oh?
See, when I do this, I am promising that I won't tickle you today, right? Because that's called keeping your word. That's a good thing, right? Because you don't like being mercilessly tickled. Oh, don't tickle me, don't tickle me. No, no, no. Help, help. Okay, I'm safe, I'm safe. No, my hands, my hands. Why are you tickling me? Why are you tickling me? No, I surrender. I have a pillow. I have a pillow for defense. Okay, I'm safe. I'm safe. No, don't tickle me with the pillow. Oh, my God. Okay, I give up. I give up. You win. You win. You win. You win. You're the best.
Love you, bye.
I love you too, kiddo.
I went down.
And if you need anything before Baba or Mama gets up, just let me know, okay?
Okay.
Just knock first. That's all I ask. Hey, Gina. Oh, okay.
Bye.
Bye, kiddo. I've been tickle tortured, guys. It's been horrible. So, I got to tell you a little story. So I'm asleep, and I hear a knock at my door. Now, anybody who's ever had kids or watched kids full time will understand what I'm about to say, because there's certain sounds that your child makes that you are like perfectly attuned to, if that makes any sense, and they wake you up like that, right? I have actually woken up in the middle of the night from a dead sleep because I heard her moving around before. You know what I mean? Yeah, like puking. That's another example. It's like, you don't even think about it. It just kind of gets built into you. Probably a biological thing. Yeah, instinctual, exactly. So I get up, like, and I'm laying here in bed, and I'm just like, I don't understand. And then I hear her distinct knock at my door, and I'm like, oh, God, okay. So I immediately get over, rush over, and get up to the door, and I'm like, okay, I'm here. And I'm there in my PJs, you know, no glasses, you know, I'm just like, okay, what can I do for you, kiddo? And she looks down at me, and she does that thing where she's deciding on her words, because she's still working on that. She's like, and then she says, okay, you know, puts a hand on me. You can get some more sleep, but then you have to come play with me. In case anyone's wondering, the game we were playing was Planet Coaster, by the way, which we actually bought for a exploration, but I have continued to play with her because we've been adding to the same park bit by bit for months every time we get a chance to play on it and work on it, and whatever she's in the mood. By the way, I wasn't kidding about the confetti field, or I guess she wasn't kidding about the confetti field. She has this area which is just absolutely swarmed with confetti. There's literally confetti cannons. It's not a joke. She has actually played Kirby. She also likes Donkey Kong Country Returns. I think I mentioned that the other day. Anywho. Oh, nice, Dakota. You suck. Let's get some music going. We'll go with the generic, because my brain's not here. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Loreweek. I don't even have my ring on yet. There we go. A couple of news tidbits for the early bit, other than Minnie's Ann being the most amazing thing ever. I have a question for you guys. Since most people watch my Loreweek, I figure this is a good time to ask you guys. And this is also for those of you on the VOD. How many of you use the MP3 RSS podcast thing I've got going on? So for those of you not aware, all of the Monday, Tuesday, and Friday ruminations nowadays, and for the last couple of months now, I've been pushing out as MP3s so that people can listen to them or download them or whatever. There's a link to the RSS feed on my website, and I believe I'm on iTunes as well. So I'm curious how many people use it, because I have no information to track it. So I have to just ask you guys. I'm sure there's a way to track it, but I don't have access to said way to track it. Yeah, it's because, for those of you not aware, YouTube... Nobody looks at my website. YouTube, if you want to play something, you have to leave the app open unless you subscribe to YouTube Red. Unlike Twitch, which just lets you listen to something even if you silence the phone or whatever. So the MP3 stuff is for people who are basically just listening to it, and they can just download it or grab it into whatever podcast software you prefer to use, and then be like, bam, and then you just have the thing. So this is me asking how many people use that feature, because like I said, we've been doing it for a couple months now. Yeah. Anywho, and I manually upload those pretty much when I wake up the day of the episode going live. So if it's like very early on a Monday, Tuesday, or Friday and you don't see it yet, it's because I'm not awake yet. A couple other tiny little tidbits of news. Gwent is apparently going to have... Yeah, I haven't seen you in a while, Brother Box. Gwent is apparently going to have a complete overhaul, which they're working on for the next few months. I don't have much to say about that, other than the fact that it sounds like more mismanagement. If you pay attention to all the information and all the news that's been going through it, it's like, yeah, this sounds like they just kind of didn't really know what they were doing with this, and pushed their developers just a little bit too hard, as usual. I don't know about you guys, but I'm filled with this morning. Words. So, thank you very, very much, Valvedrix. I hate you for not doing a Twitch Prime sub, but I love you for doing a sub. I do still very much appreciate it. That Twitch money is helping out more than you know. especially since the Patreon money has basically plateaued. So thank you very, very much for that. Yeah, exactly. 6-month overhaul. It sounds crazy. And also, hopefully you're having fun out there, Roximus. I've been watching your Twitter and the images you've been posting in Discord. I even shared a few with Minizan earlier because she still wants to go to Disneyland someday. Sorry, should I not have shared that? It didn't even occur to me. Because I am so filled with fear at this fact. Thank you very, very much. I'm going to say Melciniton and Melkiniton, because I can never remember which one it's supposed to be. And I always feel really stupid. But I really do hope you're having a good day, too. Thank you very, very much for that, as ever. That is super helpful, as I said. That's not just a saying. Believe it or not, I don't like saying things unless I really mean them. Or I'm making a joke. And I'm not making a joke about Twitch stuff. That is very helpful. Thank you. What will our next game topic be? I guess that will be... So, there's been what effectively... So it's Melciniton. Okay, I'm going to try to burn that into my memory. There's been effectively no news this week. Again, I have a recurring channel now on my Discord, which is just like, hey, do you have any topics you want to discuss? And I had two just mentioned this week that I want to go ahead and jot down, so... We're going to... Oh, actually, I guess that's actually next topic, because we're still in the pre-ramble. There we go. In the pre-ramble, though, I also want to mention something else. So Shenmue, I guess 1 and 2 are both coming out on PC this year. Ooh. I don't know if they're doing anything with it. It might just be a port, but I mean, ports are still good things. Just, you know, woo. Probably would have been better if we had a proper remake, but we know how incredibly unlikely it is that we're actually getting proper remakes these days. And then we have Banner Saga 3, which now has a release date for anybody following the Banner Saga stuff. So that's kind of cool. Channel awesome? Nope. I got nothing to say about that. Not a word. The end of an era. This is very true. For those of you not aware, the era of man has ended. Oh my god, they had their lights turned on. Who knew? Arkham Knight? Actually, I have played a bit of Arkham Knight, but I haven't played all the way. Nope. Not even bringing that one up next time. That is just way too charged of a topic. I can't even mention that without issues. Yeah, PC ports... I'm in favor of it for the preservation of history factor, if nothing else. I'm not saying that there's not other benefits. I'm saying just in almost every case, the preservation factor is worth PC ports. I have no idea, Jaludo. I suppose I could talk about the channel awesome thing in one very brief way. This is going to sound very strange, but some people have asked me over the years why I have never actually joined a network. And believe it or not, it's been a deliberate choice on my part. I have... You know what? We could turn this into a real topic. Hang on. And no, I haven't seen the Lost in Space thing. Now, there's going to be some cynicism on display here. I'm just going to let you guys know. I'm actually not going to be discussing Channel Awesome at all. I'm just going to be talking about networks. Because the word networks has to do with another word. There's a concept, which is very common, hello Black Vial, that it's very, very common. It's been around for basically as long as humans have been around. You know, this is going back into the BC era. They've used different words, different terms to describe them. It's basically a connector point between you and your audience. The people who have the money and the power connect the creative works with their audience, right? Now, said in the most neutral terms possible, you could see... Oh, God! You can see... Thank you very, very much, Emperor Valerian. I wasn't expecting that. Would you like to put that towards anything? I'm actually using a new method to keep track of those, just to be more accurate about it. Oh, by the way, we will be playing Overwatch later, just as a heads up on that. See you around, Bragwin. So for anybody who wants to be in on that and get in the queue, I'm going to start taking queues basically now. So just let me know if you want to be in part of the Overwatch co-op story mode stuff. I want to try that. So yeah, there's Valvedrix. Rouge, you got it. We'll put it towards Ridra. I don't know how to pronounce that. Which is here. Rudra no Hihao, I guess is how that would be pronounced. Emperor Valerian 15. There we go. Okay, so we had Valvedrix. Now I gotta catch up a bit. Corwin, Corrales, Juanta, God, I can talk. Takoida, Warwager. Yeah, we're doing the archive stuff. We're doing the story stuff. Nova Knight, if you're there, I might shove you up, depending on if you're at work. So I'll put you on the needs to happen now. Next, Nautic. They have dipped their toe into story modes max time, and every time they do, it's awesome, and I want them to do more of it. Let's talk about networks. Logically speaking, it makes perfect sense for a company to be like, we have money, you have creative talent, let's work together. I mean, that just makes so much logical sense, right? The problem is so obvious, however, that I don't even have to tell it to you, do I? I mean, ignoring cynicism and bitterness and sardonicism or whatever, I imagine most of you can already tell me what the problem is with that arrangement. See, the reality is, in the last, I'd say 3 or so centuries, maybe less, the amount of power, for lack of a better term, in the dynamic between the creative side and the company side has shifted heavily towards the company side. Now, that may sound like a weird thing, because logically a company side can't do anything creatively unless they have the creative side, right? Does that make sense? The problem here is, as human culture has grown, as societies have expanded, as we have more and more civilization, nations have become a thing, communication, mass communication has become a thing. Basically, the pot is bigger, and therefore the number of people who are creative in that are bigger. And so we have a situation where if we lose you, who gives a crap? We've got 50 other people who are begging to take your place. You have no negotiating power because we can replace you for someone who is desperate for a chance to get in on this. Right? In other words, an approach has been pushed. Again, it's hard to decide when, but at least for the last couple centuries, has been pushed for the idea that the creative side of things are basically worthless. Like, you're dime a dozen, okay? You don't matter. You know what I'm talking about. I'm sure most of you do. And this applies to book publishers. That's why I say it's been going back for a couple centuries, because this really got started with books, with publishers putting out novels and whatnot. Book publishers, video game publishers, music license labels, which are the devil, networks, like we have with the YouTube stuff now. And yeah, they can ruin your work. It's also, so you have voice acting. This is another one. This has been a continuing problem. It is still a problem. So being a part of a network means you are automatically taking that risk right out the gate. And whatever contracts you sign are going to have long-term ramifications. For example, right now I own everything I do, except for this music that's playing right now. That's the only thing I don't own. In fact, this is actually a remix of mine of the actual music from Morrowind. So technically, I do actually own this. I don't own Witcher 3, but I did take this recording. You know, just about everything you see here is something I have produced to some extent or another. I own my show, 100%, right? And that's something that I decided several years ago was important to me, because while there are advantages of having a network, there are massive disadvantages too. As Tazara is kind of pointing out in chat, the moment you become part of a network, you are basically saying, now we own this, or worse, you own this, and now you are the one who is in charge of me. And at that point, I'm just an employee. I'm just trying to do whatever it is you tell me to do. I lose agency over what I produce. I lose input into how I produce it. And I don't necessarily own everything that I produce. Now, this all varies based on... no, I don't own this guy. She does. There are, of course, advantages to joining a network as well. That is something that is true. I don't want to sound like it's a universally negative thing. I guarantee you that if a few years ago I had joined one of the networks that were trying to poach me, because there were several, I would be having more view count. I would have more internet exposure, whatever. I would have more viewers. I would be bigger. But I don't know if I would be better as a consequence of that, because, well, first of all, the network basically has the right to fire you at a moment's notice, which means, let's say that I did take one of those deals and I was like, hey, I'm working for whatever. I'm not going to name names. Not going to name names, but I'm working for whatever group. Yay, I'm working for whatever group. And we've decided to cancel your feature. Well, now what? I can go to YouTube and start doing what I'm doing now, but it's almost like starting over from scratch, because I may not even be allowed to tell my audience, hey, I'm on YouTube now. I've actually seen that happen, by the way. I'm not going to name names, but I know someone who was on a network, who was fired from that network, who made the shift to YouTube and just... he wasn't allowed to tell his own viewers he was on YouTube. They had to independently search for him there, and he put it on his own website, but of course we know how people are about that. Website, emotes, let's see some lore, wwws. You see the problems. There's a lot of risk, and there's a lot of flaws with the network concept, and it all boils back down, in my opinion, to that same problem. It's the same problem with video game publishers, although we're kind of moving away from that one, but it is still the same problem with video game publishers. It's still a massive problem for book publishers, and it's still a absolutely gargantuanly huge doom problem when it comes to music license labels. The entire reason I started using the term copywrong was because of music license labels. I mean, it's a concept that's existed before that, but music labels are the ones who really made it bad. They're the ones who abused the crap out of that concept. I had to edit out 40 seconds out of an 8-hour video because of music license labels. Among other far more egregious problems. So, and it's the really problem is, right now, what do you want to call my job? YouTube, Twitch, whatever creators? We're not that big yet. This is still a growing industry. And I point that out because I want to place a pattern before you. And I'm sorry, I really hope it doesn't go this way. But simple historical patterning will showcase what happened here. Books, right? People started writing. People started writing books. People started writing novels. Take them to the local printing press. Probably pay out of their own pocket or whatever. It shouldn't. No, Dream Whisperer. It's just an emote. More and more people started writing. The Enlightenment happened, right? Books became more and more. No, Brother Box. I have a very busy schedule, and I'd have to take care of a child very well. As books became more prolific, as more and more people wrote fiction and novels and nonfiction novels, that's when the publishers started getting involved and started taking more and more power, because the more people producing that creative work, the larger of an industry it is, the more political power sits on the publisher side of the equation, the network side of the equation. Because your value shrinks relatively. Now, I actually don't agree with that. Even from a purely economic perspective, I don't agree with that. If I may, the 57th rule of acquisition. Good customers are as rare as latinum. Treasure them. I honestly believe that too many companies don't understand the value of the creative work and of the consumer side of things. That too many companies devalue them because they look at them as if they are a commodity rather than a person. So, I can't believe I just quoted a rule of acquisition, but whatever. It's a good rule. It's my favorite rule of acquisition, actually. In my opinion, the publishers, the network side of this, are making a mistake. They look at this and they say, well, you're worthless. I'm going to go with someone else because you're replaceable. It doesn't matter if you're good. It doesn't matter if you're popular. It doesn't matter if you're loyal. All you are is a commodity. Your value is equal to the same value of any other random person they could pick up off the street. And that's not true even from a purely amoral financial perspective, which I can explain very simply. Okay, I've got this toothpick, or not toothpick, floss thing. I'm like, okay, floss thing, make floss for me. It's floss music. And then I'm like, you know what? I got an entire, I really do. I actually have an entire thing. I know you can't see them, of fresh floss here. Thank you, Nova Knight. So you're worthless to me. But that's not actually true, is it? Because if we're taking the whole thing into effect, every time I bring you in, I have to spend more man hours on you. I have to craft your image. I have to produce your music for you. I have to put more money into getting you started so that you can get to the point where you're making me money over here. I'm basically starting over every time I do this with a new artist, with a new musician, with a new band, with a new writer, with a new video game developer. I'm dumping new money into you, and it's all, anybody will tell you this, it's always harder to market a brand new person than a pre-existing person from a creative perspective, right? You know, who, right? Even if people disagree on an individual level, it is simply more, people are more likely to buy a game made by, I'll use an older example, BioWare. How many of you used to buy games from BioWare on faith because it was made by BioWare? But each time you dispose of someone like that, you got to start that all over. You got to start that whole process and build up that consumer trust and build up that marketing campaign and dump more money into it. So even if you completely ignore the moral perspective, even if you completely ignore the possibility of being a decent person or adding to the substance of the universe or anything positive like that, even if you are just thinking about the money, it's still the wrong mentality. So I never finished my earlier thought. Networking, right? It started with books. So many people are making books. So you're worthless. So the publishers kind of got bad. Then radio was actually the next one. And that kind of led to the music label industry. And that kind of got bad. Theater is kind of part of this, but theater kind of did a weird thing on the side. We're not going to get into that. And then, thank you, goddamn Batman. And then after music became big, the music labels became big. Same thing happened, same process. You're worthless. Television. How many people... Television's been weird, because television's kind of still going, but mostly because it mutated into something else. But television had the same exact thing happen. Television, the big networks, the big three, you know? You want to make a show on my station? Make it worth my time, cigar. You know. That became bad. And then we had video games. Movies are part of this too, but that, again, that's kind of another ball of wax. And now we finally have internet entertainers, or whatever the hell we are. And the bigger this industry becomes, the worse networks will get, I predict. Because that's what always has happened. With every other industry that's grown, the larger it gets, the more political power seemingly sits on the network side of the affairs, and the worse the networks tend to be. And a few years ago, I did a nice, long, deep look into this situation and said, okay, I got to choose something for the coming years. I have to decide something that's going to happen and change my career for the next decade or two. And I decided to stay out of the network business, and I think I've explained why over the last, 10 minutes or however long I've been talking here. So, you want me to talk about Channel Awesome? That's what I have to say about that. Hi, Sakage. I got another personal one for you. I used to buy Paper Mario things. Yes, I will be streaming Overwatch after this, Brother Box. So we're going to get into some really geeky stuff because this is a requested topic. I might just merge these topics, actually. Actually, no, hang on. I've changed my mind. We're not talking about RPG difficulty next. Changed my mind. Sorry. I just want to bring this up really briefly. I have no idea, Tazora. I've been told that. My lawyer told me that once. Don't worry, it was just for the rights thing, but yeah. So let's talk about the fact that there is a basically a Sega Mini, the Sega Mega Drive Mini. Yay! Don't buy it. I'm gonna start with that. How many of you have ever heard of AT Games? Honest question. I imagine most people will answer no. And that's fine. What games it's gonna have doesn't even matter. Just for you, Pika Clone. Yeah, I don't expect anyone to know who AT Games are. Do me a favor and Google them. They've been around for several years. They make garbage. I don't mean literally garbage. I mean figurative garbage. They make really, really bad hardware. If you look back, they have actually made several Sega Mini stuff before now. Did you know the Genesis Mini has been a thing for a few years? You've probably never heard of it because it's garbage. It is an emulator thing just like the SNES Mini is or whatever, but unlike the SNES Mini, which is a carefully crafted, well-designed piece of hardware, AT Games made the Genesis Mini and other devices, and they don't even have proper sound emulation. They don't have anything good about them at all. The buttons don't even work that right on the controllers. They tend to stick or be non-responsive. They break easily. The consoles themselves break easily. They're trash. Don't waste your money on them, okay? I understand the appeal, but do keep in mind Sega is not making these things, and that's important. Sega is outsourcing the actual construction of these things to AT Games, okay? And that's kind of one of the things I wanted to talk about because, oh yeah, an amazing sequence. Because there have been several people who have been, oh my god, yeah, they're making a Mega Drive Mini. This is amazing. This is awesome. Made by AT Games. Why? You would think they would have at least understood by now that the reason the Genesis Mini and the other things they've made have failed is because they were made by AT Games. Because they're crap. And yeah, this is why I wanted to mention this isn't quite a topic per se. This is more of a informative thing because I was excited about it too. I was like, dude, yeah, awesome. Sweet, I can't wait to get that. It reminds me of something else. This is where the topic part comes in. It's kind of about knockouts. Or knockoffs, excuse me, wrong terminology. If you... hi, Ms. Cardo. If you a few months ago were to be like, I'm going to look up a NES Classic on Amazon, you would see the NES Classic being sold by scalpers who are evil and need to die. And then you would see a whole bunch of knockoff NES Minis. Some of which are actual NES reproductions, so they can play physical cartridges, which aren't really that useful because they require the physical cartridges, which may or may not work anymore and will stop working within the next 30 years or so. They sell like this one, it's like $20, 500 games on the $20 one. Yes, that sounds like a great deal, and it's only $20. Do I need to keep going? I probably don't. There's also the NES cartridges, which have 500 games on them. Don't buy those. This is, yeah, the 50 million things in one. They're trash. They are barely functional trash. I have never actually tested one of the new NES Classic ones myself, but I have seen some of these. I have tested a few for myself, and several other people have tested a few of these as well. I have secondhand experience with people I know and trust in person who actually have tried some of this crap. It's gutter trash. It's bootleg garbage. And it makes me wonder, and this is kind of the topic here, why that's a thing. Now, the best answer I can come up with from a financial perspective for why this kind of crap is a thing is because people are stupid. I don't mean the buyers, actually. I mean the people making this. I feel like too many people... Tiger Electronics... Let's not even talk about Tiger Electronics. Bad memories. I feel like too many people look at the Wii. The Wii... There was a big wave of Wii ripoffs. Who look at the Atari, we can go back to the 70s on this one, and say, that's popular, I'm going to make something as close to it as I can to fool enough people, and then I'll get tons of money. However, most of these don't actually sell all that well. They do get purchases, obviously. They do make some money, but I have to honestly question how much net profit they make off of doing this, because most of their sales are either from people who don't know any better and are too shy to return it, from people who are basically it's an accident, who are fooled by the knockoff and are too shy to return it, and people who actually want it for some reason. I'm not even sure that's a market, but that's not exactly a big market share, and that's I know making hardware isn't the most expensive thing in the world, but I gotta imagine that they're spending a little bit too much money on something that's basically a gamble. I mean, maybe I'm weird, but I don't find... Like, if I'm sitting in a board meeting by myself, because I'm the only one on the board, and someone comes to me and says, Lore, I've got a business idea for you. There's this other market over here. And this market is filled with... And I'm like, okay, that's good. Say thank you to Equalitas for being 2 months in a row. Thank you very, very much, Equalitas. As ever, as I've said like twice today, those Twitch subs, very much appreciated. Thank you. If someone comes up to me and says, hey, Lore, Chairman Lore? Loreman Lore? And says, hey, there's this new thing. It's called it's a toothpick, and it's a I'm just gonna keep using this as an example. It's the floss thing, and it's really big and it's really popular. I do like Sir Lore. I've always liked the title Sir. It's really big, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna make a really cheap version of it and hope people buy ours by accident. No! Get out of my office! Also, you're fired. I mean, this is such a bad financial model. Unless you are spending basically pennies on the production side of this and are not marketing this, this is literally a niche of a niche market. This is something that is not going to generate a particular large amount of money. It's going to be a waste of time, even if it isn't a waste of money. And I'm sorry, but time is actually more valuable than money, as weird as that may sound. Right? Like, I don't get this. I don't get the concept of these knockoffs. Now, okay. So, this kind of does tie... Let's tie this back into the Genesis thing. Let's tie this back into the Mega Sega Mini thing. Because what's happening here is that the AT games, they make the cheap knockoff thing. And for whatever reason, and I don't know why, they have basically made some kind of deal... Well, just because a product is made in China does not make it crap, Dakota. I'm sorry. I can point to a product that was made in China right here. I'm not going to bring it on screen, but here, I'll bring a piece of it on screen. This was made in China. So was this. I have to imagine that what's happening here, and now Nintendo owns the rights to the stream, is that AT Games has, for whatever reason, basically made a deal with Sega. And that Sega is now producing is basically handling most of what would be the expense side of things, and is functionally acting as a network for AT Games to push AT Games' product out into more people's hands. And you can kind of see why I'm bringing this up, because this is actually really scummy if you think about it. Because what's happening is Sega is selling you an AT Games product. Now, if you don't get what I mean by that, I once again ask you, how many of you knew the Mega Drive Mini was made by AT Games? They have mentioned it. They're not hiding it, but they are also not advertising that fact. Yay. One of these days I'll have something really positive to talk about on Loreweek, and it'll be awesome. So my next topic is geeking out. I love geeking out. You guys like geeking out? I don't know what Sega's getting out of this. I gotta be honest with you. I really don't. Let's talk about RPG difficulty. Now, God, this is something I've actually spent a lot of time debating and thinking about. Let's talk about the idea of proper challenge. So let's go ahead and mention the first thing. Let's take the concept of grinding and let's throw it out the goddamn window. Okay. Now it's tumbling down the stairs. Okay, now it's landed on the ground. Oh, it's still rolling a little bit. Okay, it's in the street. It's in the... Oh, okay, garbage truck got it. And the UPS truck, too. Damn. Okay, now there's a bus going by. Oh, the bus actually caught it, so now it's rotating on the wheels of the bus. And the bus is going to the airport, and it's in the air. And then it's launched into space. Okay, it's gone. It's as gone as it's freaking getting. Oh no, there's a steamroller in space! Grinding should not actually be a factor when you consider leveling difficulty in an RPG. Let's just say that as bluntly as we can. Should not be. If the point of your game is grinding, then this conversation no longer applies to that game. Hence, when we're talking about an RPG, where we're talking about the difficulty curve and the what's the word I want to use? Relative power level curve of the player, grinding is not a part of that equation. Yeah, it got through airport security very quickly. It was on the wheel. The first thing you need to do is you need to decide what kind of progression system you're using. Now, there are two types of general progression for the player, and this is very important to math out early on because you need to understand relative power output. So the two general types of progression is horizontal progression and vertical progression, and both of these give you your actual point on the graph of exactly where your power level is, okay? Horizontal progression is easy to explain. Gear, talents, vehicles, mounts, custom abilities that you only get for certain areas, or zone abilities. Cooldowns kind of fall under horizontal, but that's kind of a maybe. You know, all of this stuff, pretty much everything that you tack onto your character is part of horizontal progression, okay? Vertical progression is extremely simple and extremely linear. It's the most controlled element when it comes to RPG difficulty. That's basically your level and your stats. The idea of vertical progression is if your character is buck naked and has no talents and no abilities and is basically just created, but is level 50, they're at 50 on the horizontal, or excuse me, on the vertical progression. Make sense? So, first thing you need to decide when it comes to designing RPG difficulty is which of these things you want to lean on more. Now, if you've played any RPG ever, you might notice, just thinking about this for a second, most games lean heavily on the horizontal line of difficulty. Not every game does, but a lot of games use the horizontal thing in order to present the actual power level for the player. That is very normal. There's nothing wrong with that. It's very understandable why that is, because this bar gives more choice to the player. This bar just makes them level. Make sense? Some games, very, very few RPGs, will basically have all of it be right here. I will actually give you an example of this. Final Fantasy IV has about 90 or so % of its overall power output purely on the vertical bar. The only thing that you add on the horizontal bar at all is the gear. And even the gear isn't really all that big of a thing when it comes to FF4. A level 70 will do more damage than a level 40 with the best gear in the game. So that's an example of what I'm talking about by the vertical progression. To use a completely different example, let's go with what's probably the most definitive example I can come up with. Let's go with well, that's such another thing that that's a different topic to answer yourself. Totally different topic. We're not even there yet. We're still discussing player output, and we're not even at the point of mob output yet. FF12, that is a good example. I was going to use FF9, but FF12 is a better example. In FF9, if you're level 99 with no licenses and no gears, you're crap. Like, you will have more HP, but that's basically all you've got. You got a big health pool, and your stats are simply not that great. So if we're to use the curve, FF12 is over here, and FF4 is up here. You with me so far? Now, relatively speaking, if you're paying attention, both of these points would still equal out, assuming they are mathed out properly. But it's which direction you want to lean on more. So there's nothing wrong with leaning more in one direction, more in the other direction, or even trying for an in-betweeny thing. It's also worth noting, and this should be obvious, that a lot of vertical progression directly ties into horizontal progression, and I once again refer to talents as a direct example of that. Yeah, that's true. That is very true, Crimson King. FF8, by the way, is a very horizontal one. It's so horizontal that the vertical side of things arguably doesn't actually exist at all in FF8's system. Because, as I've said before, levels in FF8 are more a function of difficulty than they are of actually increasing your overall power output. So, very heavy on the horizontal side of things. So, which of these you want, like I said, which of these you want to lean on is up to you. But again, that's where I was. Vertical tends to like with talents. I'll give you a direct example of what I'm talking about again. Diablo 2. In Diablo 2, you level. Now, your levels are a very small amount of it. Diablo 2 is another game that leans heavily on the horizontal bar. However, levels give you horizontal bar points. They give you talent points. And those talent points that you put into do they call them skill points in D2? Whatever, they are talent points. You put them into your bars, into lightning or cold or arcane or whatever. Frost, excuse me. Lightning, frost, fire. That's what it actually is. And then that's what actually pushes your horizontal power up. So the level is directly tied to the horizontal bar. And that's a very common thing too. Now, most games do that to basically encourage you to level, or in some cases, to force you to level. Because otherwise you could go through D2 basically at level junk and have... In addition to another problem, if there wasn't another problem and the talents, or the skill points, or whatever the hell it was, your level wouldn't mean anything in D2. It's almost completely ancillary. The other thing is the gear dependence. Now, this is another way that games will decide on forcing you to level. They will have amazing gear in D2, and it requires level 32. Now, anybody who's played D2 anytime recently will tell you, you probably won't even be level 32 by your first time through normal difficulty. You could beat the game at like level 25 or so. It's not that hard. And then you'll have to start your nightmare difficulty play mode, and that's when you'll get to level 32. Or you can go grind, of course. But level recs on gear also basically forces the player to level. Now, I am not placing judgment on any of this. I am just laying out the construction of how these kind of formats work and how a lot of both lines tend to tie into each other directly. Very few games have almost everything leaning on the horizontal bar to the point where your level is something that doesn't matter at all, or indeed it doesn't even exist. I will name another example. Asheron's Call is a game that very, very heavily leaned on the horizontal bar. It had been argued, and the devs themselves had discussed this a couple of times in several player discussion groups, brought up the idea that levels literally shouldn't exist in AC. because the level and the leveling process itself was irrelevant. Everything is about the skills you put points in, you put experience into directly, your gear, which is extremely important, and that's actually kind of it. Basically, there's other factors, but it was all on this side of the bar. Now, dungeons had level requirements, some gear had level requirements, but for the most part, gear had skill requirements, which meant you just had to have enough skill points put into that. You get where I'm going with this. So there's a lot of malleability in between the horizontal bar and the vertical bar. In several games across the... FF2 is another good example of a game that tried something completely differently. FF2, if I was to define it, actually didn't have a horizontal or a vertical bar. It just had a weird in-betweeny diagonal thing. Because running around and grinding was effectively pushing out the horizontal bar directly. So the horizontal bar basically replaced the vertical bar, but still functionally was the vertical bar. It's weird. So a lot of games have tried this. So that's the first thing you have to see. We haven't even gotten to the difficulty yet. The first thing you have to decide is where you want player power output to rest in these concepts. And there's, as I think we've discussed over the many RPGs we just mentioned, there's a lot of permutations of how you can do this. This is, however, the very first thing you need to do before you get to anything else with regards to difficulty or anything like that, because you have to decide how strong the player should be before you just decide anything else. Now, player power output... yeah, I wasn't even going to get into that, Takoida, because honestly, that's a whole other ball of wax. That requires a complete different mindset to approach, so I'm not going to actually bring that up in this, because this is more about levels. Or not, more about numbers than it is about the actual, let's call them more mutators. Let's call them mutators. I think that's a good term for that. Because some abilities by themselves don't actually change a lot. It's like, I have the ability to do this special thing, and it doesn't give me any new stats. It doesn't make me hit harder, but it allows me to do this, which allows me to do other things, which increase my overall damage output. Right? Or reduce my damage intake, or increase the amount of healing I could do, or reduce, there's all sorts of things like that. That's the good stuff, but you got to do that stuff later, basically. You got to establish this baseline before you even get to that kind of a thing. There's a reason why World of Warcraft started with basically nothing like that, and has been adding on stuff like that over the years ever since. Because you got to get this baseline first. So we've got the baseline. We've figured out exactly where our parallel... So let's assume... Let me use a game that I know extremely well, FF6. FF6 leans strangely balanced on the horizontal and the vertical line. Because level is directly tied into almost every equation in the game. The damage equations, the damage taken equations, the healing equations, the health equations. Virtually every equation in the game actually has your level as part of that. And so... if you level and get no gear, you're good. If you're very low level and have good gear, you're good. It's a very balanced approach to things. It's very difficult to pull that off, though. And also, they had to literally design the levels to accommodate this, but that's another separate topic. All I'm saying is that we're going to use this model because I know it best. So we're pretty much right in the middle of the two bars. Next thing you have to decide is how your power output should be at any given point in time. Now, in any given RPG, you have a pretty good idea of where players should be at any given point in time, and you should know where a player can be at any point in time. Getting back to what we were talking about during Super Metroid, for example, if you think of everywhere that you are physically capable of reaching as like an expanding area that you are, and the gas that is expanding this, that's the player, right? And the moment you unlock a new area or complete a new boss or gain a new ability or whatever, that area that the gas can expand into expands, right? Makes sense? You have to know where the player is capable of getting, and you have to design where the player should be. Okay. Hang on, we're not there yet. Now, the should perspective, let me go ahead and now we're finally going to say something that's opinion. In my opinion, if you're going to go with a middle-of-the-road route, what you should do is you should decide how do I put this? You should design your game as if the player never stopped playing the game to go level, right? You should never... This is my opinion, but you should never design a game such that at boss B, we'll call him the Grey Wolf boss in honor of Grey Wolf. The Grey Wolf he does X amount of damage and he has X amount of health. And if you design him so that those numbers are sufficiently high, so that if you have just been playing the game up to him and he is a wall of damage, he's a meat gate, then in my opinion you have failed. Because you need to design it so that if you are going through, not running from any battles, not going out of way to grinding, this should be statted to be at equivalent to where that level should be. Now, yeah, and FF10 is a great example. This is usually a difficulty cliff, is what this is usually referred to as. If the game pretty much requires you to stop playing the game and go level, we have an issue. Now, what's funny is this is actually one of the easier things to balance out when it comes to difficulty. All you have to do is sit down and do some basic math, for example. You have 3 members of your party. Each member of your party, yeah, exactly, the count. Each member of your party has, let's just say, 1,000 health, okay? So already we have enough information to judge how much damage this boss should do on average. Just with that variable and nothing else. This is why I bring this up. It's actually easier to do than it sounds, but it is time-consuming, and it is my opinion that this is one of the reasons why too many games have difficulty cliffs, is because the developers did not have time to sit down and really math all this out. So, okay, you should have, if you're going linearly, if you haven't... Now, when I say going linearly, I don't want to stress something. Takoida mentioned roaming in search of mist stuff or whatever. That should be built in. If your game has any kind of exploration whatsoever, I'll again use FF6 as an example here. South Figaro Cave, you go up, then you go here, there's a little side passage which goes into that, and then you have this passage which goes over here, this passage goes over here, then you're out. So you should not design the difficulty, my opinion, such that they are going through there, right? That's just straight through the cave. And you can, depending on what type of encounter system you're using, you can usually math out the number of encounters on average a player should have, and the number of general amount of increment of power level that they have received at that point in time. Because you know all the gear that's available, either from stealing or from drops or from actual chests, and you know how much experience they will receive on average for the fights that are within a region, if you know the average numbers of fights they will have through there. Now, in a game like FF6, this is easy because it's tile-based. You can literally count how many tiles it will take a player to go ahead and get all the little side things in South Figaro Cave and say, okay, this is a made-up number, 50 tiles. So 50 steps through South Figaro Cave. So we know, based on the way we have designed the random number generator, that they will have, again, made-up numbers anywhere from 3 to 7 encounters. So we balance this out as if they're going to have 5. We assume 5 encounters for this area. And sorry, running out of breath a little bit. I'm allergies, hard to breathe. I'm not literally like winded. I'm having trouble taking in air. So we've got an average of 5 encounters. We know the type of encounters that are here. In fact, in South Figaro there are 3 different things of Tizara. Thank you, Tizara. I hate you. 3 different... jot down a 7 there. From 3 different monster formations. So, we can say rather, with 3 monster formations, with 5 encounters, we can pretty much determine the average amount of experience that a player will have having gone through there, as well as including the items they got in that area. So you see what I mean by the fact that it's relatively easy, if time-consuming, for a developer to say, this should be where the player should be at after having gone through this area. Now, obviously, sometimes they're going to fall behind, and sometimes they're going to get ahead. In my opinion, that's not something you should balance for in the main design of the game. That is my opinion. There are some people who don't agree with that. Some people believe you should... yeah, that's a good example, that Black File. I've actually played that game. Some people believe you should design it as if it's the top end. So for example, using the example I just gave, all 7 encounters with the highest experience possible thing, and all party members are alive. All of these and of course they get all the chests. So some people believe you should balance for the high end of the thing. Some people believe you should balance for the low end of the thing, which is 3 encounters and, well, none of the chests, basically. and maybe a player who's dead, so you're one person behind on level, right? That's opinion. That's up to you. I personally try to aim for, in story stuff, to aim for the middle ground. And part of the reason why I say that is because if you design the initial design run-through of the difficulty be in this middle ground spot, it's easier to go back and say, well, why don't we push this up? Because there's going to be playtesting after this. So if someone gets through and is like, man, I'm just breezing through this section, you can go back and be like, okay, why don't we push up some of the capacities of this enemy? And you don't always have to just adjust stats on an enemy, too, in order to make them more difficult. Now, FF6 isn't the greatest example of this because FF6 is a turn-based game, or an ATB game, rather. But it's still possible to affect difficulty without just making them hit harder. For example, let's go ahead and say, let's keep using South Figaro. Let's assume, I guess we'll go ahead and do South Figaro 2 since we're staying there. Let's assume we're talking about Tunnel Armor, okay? So Tunnel Armor is a joke of a boss, but of course he's a joke of a boss. He's a joke of a boss because you fight him with two people, one of whom may or may not be underleveled, because they did think this through, if you pay attention. So, but let's assume Tunnel Armor just shows up at the beginning of the game when it's still Terra, Edgar, Locke, and that's it, I guess. So Tunnel Armor shows up. We know roughly how strong he should be, but the players are just wrecking him for some reason. Like, maybe it's because, you know, this is early in the game and we haven't given him a lot, but we want to give the player a little bit more challenge. Now, we could raise his health, but all raising the health really does is turn it into... okay, we got to segue. We have to talk about endurance fights versus intensity fights, okay? Now, there's a lot of opinion on this one too, but when it comes to difficulty, you have to decide which of those directions you want to lean in. An endurance fight is all about... An endurance fight can be done well. An endurance fight is all about testing your ability to basically get through the slog of the fight. Now, in my opinion, you shouldn't overdo an endurance fight. If every boss is an endurance fight, we have a problem. But having like one boss or a specific type of story boss or a specific type of enemy being an endurance fight, that's okay. That's my opinion. But an endurance fight is all about testing players' ability to mitigate damage, to restore health, and their ability to maintain a consistent output of damage. By contrast, an intensity fight is a fight where a lot of things are happening very, very quickly. An intensity fight usually boils down to a DPS race in a ATB style game, or a skill check in a game that's more of an action style RPG. But we're getting way off topic and there's too many things. Let's just keep going with the FF6 model for this. So in an FF6 type model, a boss like any of the three statues towards the end of Kefka's Tower would be intensity fights, whereas the Guardian is closer to an endurance fight, to give a direct example of what I'm talking about. Yeah, that's WoW is actually a great example of everything I'm talking about, but we're already on FF6, so we're going to stick with that. That was actually what was requested, was to talk about RPG difficulty when it came to something turn-based or ATB-based. RNG bosses can be intense, but it depends on the application of how that RNG works. For example, a boss that hits you from on a D1000, basically, you know, a 1 to 1000 hit, that can be intense, but I don't think I would qualify that as an intense thing myself. You also have to consider fairness into all of this. If you have a boss that can just one-shot you because of randomness, I don't think that's fair, unless actually killing you is part of the mechanics and design of the boss, if that makes any kind of sense. Again, to use WoW as an example, there's actually a fight in Zul'Gurub. I forget the name of the fight. I think it's the Bloodlord. But when you fight him, if he just kills you, and he can do that, you actually can get back up, and that's built into the encounter mechanics of the encounter. So that's a little bit of a different thing. But if you didn't just get back up and he just killed you, that would be a full-on DPS rate. Mandukir, thank you. Mandukir the Bloodlord, I was right. And yeah, bad breath, holy crap. So, endurance versus intensity, right? So now that we've kind of helped define that, let's get back to our tunnel armor at the end of South Figaro. So, we could increase his health, which would turn this in, which would basically lean a little bit more into the endurance side of the equation. We can make him do more damage, which is going to lean a little bit more towards the intensity side of the thing. Or we could add something else to basically add more that the player has to pay attention to. Give the boss the ability to do It's not bad breath, but it's the fog ability the Magitech armor has at the beginning that I almost never use unless I'm doing a speed run. I can't even think of the name of it. But and it poisons all three of your party members. So now you have an additional variable to keep in mind that will be doing additional damage to you. No, it's not bio. I can't remember what it's called. And it's not Edgar's ability either. That's called something else. I can't think of what it's. I'm going to pull up FF6 here. So, Argus. And you fight him with toothpaste, exactly. No. My point is, what you have done now is you have added another level of dynamic to the fight. Now, poison is a very basic concept, but it is something that I'm using poison as a deliberate example because poison is not a literal stat change. The boss poisoning your whole party does not increase his overall damage output any more than it increases his overall health. It does make the player deal with another element. It does make it so that you are taking more damage, but that damage is kind of a separate source. It still counts as boss DPS, but you're taking a separate source of damage, so it's mitigated in a different way, different damage calculations, and it can be dealt with in different ways. You can cure it. You can get antidotes out and just stop taking the poison damage. Now, if you want to be a dick, you can make it so the boss poisons constantly, and you're just supposed to be under poison for the sake of this fight, in which case, at that point, you are effectively doing more straight damage. By contrast, if you make it so he poisons every now and again, as one of his random options he can do, then you're making it so the player has to decide, do I want to get rid of this poison? Do I need to heal and risk this next poison killing me, or do I just try to push through the boss before the poison kills me? So this is a very, very, very basic example, but it gets across my idea, which I'm trying to explain. And that concept is fear. Thank you very, very much, Autumn Razor. I haven't seen you in a while, but as ever and as still, I very much appreciate those Twitch Prime or Twitch subs. Thank you. Even with a very, very basic thing, like just poisoning the party, you have increased the difficulty of the fight without really meddling with the stats. He still has the same, his attacks still do the same general opponent damage, his HP is still the same, and the overall power level of the player is still the same. But now you see where I'm going with this? And yeah, there's also different approaches to poison. Again, I'm using the FF6 example, but in a theoretical game you're designing, it doesn't have to be a poison that just does damage until you die. It also could do percentage damage. It could do variant damage, as in, it could do a nice big wide bracket of damage. It could do no damage at all and just nerf you, basically function as a debuff, makes it so that your attacks hit less or whatever. There are a lot of ways to vary up encounter designs that don't involve just cranking a stat one direction or another. So that's our first couple topics about RPG difficulty. There's this figuring out figuring out how you want the player to become more powerful, figuring out relative power level based on location, and then designing the boss based on where the player should be at that location. Well, thank you, Autumn Razor. It's glad to see you on stream again. Now, this is all ground level stuff, but this is the stuff I was asked to talk about, because let's talk about something a lot more dynamic. Let's use... Oh, God. Okay. This is actually a struggle to do within the FF6 format, but let's go ahead and use one of the statue fights as an example. So each of the statues has about 65,000 health. And those statues are filled with fear. Thank you very, very much, Machina. Again, still true. Those Prime subs are very much appreciated. Thank you. So we've already got a fairly decent chunk of health to go through. Now, FF6 is kind of a bad example of this because FF6's difficulty curve actually arcs down significantly when it gets to the World of Ruin. But that's because of the nature of how the World of Ruin was designed. That's kind of a separate topic. There's a reason you can beat FF6 at in the 20s, right? So let's just assume for a moment that that the Kefla's Tower doesn't exist at all. Let's just erase that, because that's actually another level of difficulty. I mean, I guess we could talk about that. So, okay, this is another thing you could do with difficulty. Again, using FF6 as the example. Hi, Eisermaster. Let's, one of the things you can do is split up the party. Literally limit the player's capacity to focus their power output. Force them to equip only certain people and decide which characters are equipped. By splitting the party into 2 and 3 groups, which FF6 does several times, you are forced to basically decide, do you want to put all your good people in one group and bad people in a group, or do you want to split them up? And whether or not you actually have where your gear spread is between the two things. Because unless you really go all out, just by doing the content of FF6, there is not actually enough gear to fully mega equip everyone. So you got your best gear, then you got your second best gear, then you got your kind of crap gear that's basically store-bought. And that's the tiers of endgame gear in FF6. Hi, Marley. So by splitting up the party, you have basically artificially increased the difficulty of anything you fight. Now, this is important. Because in my opinion, we're getting to opinion again here, as a developer, you should maintain that middle level of difficulty when you have split up the party. Because you don't know what the player has done, and therefore, how do I explain this? You should design every fight as if it's an average of player output rather than the best they can do. Or to use FF6 again as a direct example, you shouldn't design a boss encounter as if they're going to have Terra, Edgar, Sabin, and Celeste, right? Your best DPS with the best gear, right? That's not how you should design those encounters. But you also shouldn't design them as if you've got your worst. You've got Umaro and Shadow. Actually, Shadow does a lot of damage, but, you know, whatever. You need to design something kind of averaged your way through that. You need to kind of figure out some difficulty somewhere in the middle there. Class roles definitely add a part of difficulty, but again, it depends on the type of RPG you're approaching. Save that topic, Dance Yourself. We'll come back to that. So figure out the average of the general player output based on everyone that they can bring and all the gear they have access to at this point. Again, time-consuming, but very mathable. So you figure out, okay, this is if they bring 2 good people with good gear and 2 bad people with average gear, or 2 good people with bad gear and 2, there's an average point there. This is the relative average. Then you design the difficulty around this bracket right here. Now, this is my opinion. Some people believe you should design it around this bracket, as if they brought their best, because what this does then is one of 2 things. It either forces them to do this section multiple times, which you can do in FF6, or it basically makes it so that one party is doing okay, and 2 parties are struggling. Now, there's nothing wrong with that design mentality, especially for something like a last dungeon. So it depends on circumstances. So let's assume for a moment that Kefka's Tower is not actually the last dungeon. Just bear with me. So this is just another dungeon. Actually, I guess the Phoenix Cave is probably a better example of this. In the Phoenix Cave example, I would definitely average around for the middle. In Kefka's Tower as the actual last dungeon, might balance it high because it's the last dungeon. It's something special. Sense, Mike? You don't, Mandarton. You don't even keep that into account. Anytime you give the player the option to avoid increasing their power level, you ignore that in your balancing equation. You completely ignore it. That is all up to the player, and that is something you should not design around, because a player who is doing that is either going to be trying to do a challenge run, like I do all the time, and I know I'm not the only one, or is someone who has, for whatever reason, decided they don't enjoy the leveling experience of your game, in which case there's other problems with the game. You'll notice, by the way, that even if you really lean on the Moogle Charm in Final Fantasy VI, you're still going to be at a decent relative level to be able to beat the game going through it, because they designed the overall power curve and leveling curve of FF6 so that even if you have Moogle Charm, you get plenty of gear to overcome the loss of levels. Make sense? So that is something that should be designed before you even introduce something like the Moogle Charm, which I mentioned already. Moving on. So, you've split up the party. We've got a boss fight. This boss fight is the next person to talk in chat. Whoever it is, you're going to be the boss. It's Mandarton. Okay. So, Mandarton is this giant green monster, and he's just smash, right? Now, Obviously, I'm pretty big in favor of what are usually referred to as gimmick fights. Now, my reason for this is actually very simple. With certain formats of gameplay, and we'll use FF6 again as an example, there's only so much you can do with a fight that isn't gimmicky, that also isn't statty. Gimmicks add flavor to fights. Gimmicks allow the players to have more options to defeat a fight, or force the player to think in different ways to get through a fight. If you just have a boss that's like, I hit you with these 5 attacks that all do damage, well, that's just numbers at that point. If you have a boss that's, I hit you with this attack, which only hits you if you dodge it, but I hit you with this attack, which only hits you if you don't dodge it, but I hit you with this attack, but this attack actually will heal you if I also hit you with this attack while this debuff is still on. So with these, the dynamic of these 4 attacks, and then the 5th attack just hits you to make sure that the boss is still doing some kind of output. So with these 4 attacks plus the output, we now have a varied boss fight that allows the player to have choices in the fight rather than just hit the boss, heal the self. Make sense? So let's lean on gimmicks here. So for Mandarton, we're going to go with what I just said, just off the top of my head. So he's got an attack that specifically hurts you if you manage to block it or dodge it. So in FF6 format, that would mean that anyone that has a particularly high magic evasion is going to take damage, and those who don't are not. However, he has a second attack, which does the exact opposite of this. What we have now done is encouraged the player to either lean heavily on one side or the other and just heal the one attack, or balance out their party so they're taking more of an averaged amount of damage every time he does these 2 attacks. You know, like 2 party members take this attack, 2 party members take this attack. You'll notice there's still some randomization in here as well. The third attack now... what was the third attack? Oh yeah, the third attack's the one that puts a debuff on you, right? So the third attack does damage to you and puts you into... there's no equivalent in FF6, so let's just call it frozen status, okay? So now, whoever is in frozen status can be healed relatively quickly and easily. However, when he does his 4th attack, it hits like a truck unless you happen to be frozen, in which case it then heals you a little bit instead. And what you have there is an option to decide if the player wants to just go ahead and accept being frozen to take the heal, or if they feel like they can take the damage, because frozen, remember, removes your ability to act. It's basically a stun for the duration. And obviously, you don't want to just not be doing damage, so whether or not you want to be doing damage output for this turn, or whether you want to, I think I can heal this, or maybe if I put Shell up at the last second in order to prevent the amount of damage that big hit is going to be doing, it allows player choice in how they approach this combat. Now, this is just stuff I made up right off the top of my head, so this isn't the best example. But, look, I'm just saying that I've come up with several examples, Mandarton. I know FF6 extremely well. That's why I'm using it as an example. The only other game I could use is WoW, which is a really, really, really different animal. Now, the Count asks a valid question. Do you risk something becoming too gimmicky? To which I ask a counter question. What is too gimmicky? Now, that obviously is going to come down to opinion. But in my opinion, unless you go into a massive extreme, there's no such thing as too gimmicky. And I'll give an FF6 explanation here in a moment. Then he has his 5th attack, and his 5th attack just does damage. Having done all this, we can now say, okay, let's assume an average of 2 of the party members takes the first hit, an average of 2 party members takes the second hit. So we can determine how much damage that should do based on those factors. We don't want it to one-shot them. That's not the point, but we want it to hurt. So we want to do, let's say, about half the damage of anybody that anybody's taking, half their health with these initial 2 big hits that are relatively avoidable. Then we want to go ahead and have the debuff attack do, let's say, a minor amount of damage. Let's say maybe 10% of health, maybe even less than that. But of course, that's not the point. The point is the frozen thing. Then we want the big hit to do, let's go ahead and say about 90% damage, with maybe a variable up to 95%. Because the point is, it's supposed to panic the player and make them think, oh god, if they actually get hit with it, and encourage them to use that frozen mechanic without forcing them to use the frozen mechanic. And then the average damage thing, we have to decide, okay, so let's assume the players have been taking about an average of the hits from the first 2 hits, and let's say maybe one or two of the big hits. So we need to decide a thing that will kill anyone who has taken damage at this point in time, difficulty-wise, because that way because the player needs to be healing, right? So we want to decide that fifth hit, the hit that just does damage, to kill anyone who hasn't been healed up. Probably make it single target, I think. But at the same time, not kill someone who has only been hit maybe once, or not kill someone who has been hit by anything other than the big hit. So let's say maybe a 60 or so % hit from that one bam kind of a hit, right? So now we have designed a boss fight that has a lot more dynamic to it than just I have stats and here is the relative power level of the enemy. So I hope I'm making any kind of sense here. Now, the Count wants to talk about too gimmicky, so let's keep using FF6 as an example here. So the next boss is the Count. He counts a lot, and the numbers tick up. If the numbers hit 30, you die. That might be a little bit too gimmicky, but I even have to add might to that because it's difficult to reach that point of too gimmicky unless you go to an absolute extreme. Because if you have a boss that has a ticking clock in the corner, then that is a DPS race, which is a valid approach. Yeah, Doom status, a very typical thing. You know, you have a ticking clock. FF4 did this, for God's sakes. So there's nothing necessarily too gimmicky about that. Okay. What if we rewind to our Mandarton fight? What if during the Mandarton fight, he hits you with Frozen, right? And if he hits you with his follow-up attack to Frozen, it doesn't do damage, it just kills you unless you're frozen. At that point, I feel that's a little bit too gimmicky. And this is my explanation for too gimmicky. In my opinion, too gimmicky is when you take too much player agency out of the equation. In other words, the player now has no real choice but to go ahead and just and get hit by the Frozen, and then get hit by the thing in order to live through that, right? Yeah, Hunalesca is a great example of a fight that I would consider to be too gimmicky. Because you have to be hit with the reverse or whatever the hell it is for when she does zombie breath. There's no choice here. There's no way around that unless you can kill her extremely quickly. Now you could argue that something like that could be worked around, and it usually can. But that's not what we're working on. We're not at the point of designing for challenge runs. We're not at the point of designing for New Game Plus. We are designing the base level difficulty curve going throughout the course of the game. So for this boss fight, that might be too gimmicky, but even then there has to be an asterisk there, because guiding the player in a direction to finish a boss in a certain way is something that, in my opinion, should be done. You should encourage players to learn a boss encounter and then adjust their strategy to that boss. That is my opinion, of course. But there's a really, really tricky line in between encourage and force. So let's use my earlier example, Mandarton the first fight. So we got Mandarton the first and Mandarton the second. Mandarton the second is the gimmicky one, Mandarton the first is the one I already explained. So Mandarton the first, if you're underleveled, a lot of those attacks are going to hit a lot harder because they're designed as if you were higher level. And that big hit is going to just straight up kill you. But you still have the option to avoid that frozen status if you want to, because there is the ability to res in FF6. Now, that's something that has to be considered on a boss-to-boss basis when it comes to designing difficulty for a game like that. But at that point, it's still kind of in the player's hands, because they are the ones who have decided to be underleveled, or they are the ones who have basically been avoiding fights and haven't gotten gear, or haven't gotten equipments, or haven't gotten Magicite, which is the closest thing to talents in FF6, and they have basically just said, okay, I want a challenge run. That's kind of on them. That's not really taking player choice away. That is fully player choice. By contrast, however, let's go back to the Count fight. In the Count fight, you're hit with a counter that's going to just kill you in 30 seconds or whatever. You know, once it hits 30, the end. That is a pure stat fight because it's a DPS race, and if they are underleveled, now they're going to have a lot harder of a time of making that actually possible at all, never mind the difficulty that might be involved in it. So you got to think about things like this when you're doing your second or third pass of bosses. You have to think, okay, what is this fight going to be like if they're underleveled? What is this fight going to be like if they're overleveled? And I'm using those terms. Those are actually inaccurate terms. What I mean is lower power level, higher power level. Whether they have lower gear, or lower levels, or lower magicite, or lower talent, or whatever, or more, etc., etc., etc. So, now, I suppose another type of gimmicky fight. Unfortunately, I kind of have to go to World of Warcraft to explain this because I can't think of anything in the FF6 format that would be too gimmicky. But let's go to World of Warcraft. Let's say you have a fight where you have the aspect of magic, and he's like, "Roar, I will kill everything in the world because I'm a moron, and I was also making life worse for everyone." I didn't know that, though. I was just insane. And Malygos has, I mean, random guy who has nothing to do with WoW. He gets to a point where he destroys the player's ability to act as players, because he does this in the fight. At that point, you are put on the Red Dragon, and now you have to fly the Red Dragon flight in order to defeat the rest of the fight. Now, that is pure gimmick at that point. At that point, stats are actually effectively removed from the equation, because you can determine exactly what those Red Drakes can do and how much they can do it. And thus, the entire rest of the fight is full gimmick, if you understand what I mean by that. There's no way around this. There's no bypassing this. Now, okay, that's a lie. If you're at very high level, you can push him down to 1 health, and then, once you get on the Red Dragon, you just poke him once and he's dead. But at level, at 70, during Wrath of the Lich King, there was no way around this. It was mandatory. That might enter the direction of too gimmicky, because at that point you have literally taken away all player talents, all player gear, all player levels. You have removed both the horizontal and the vertical bars entirely, and are making and are making them rely on what you are allowing them to do. So you see, my own definition of too gimmicky tends to boil down to too little choice for the player, if that makes any kind of a sense. Even that could be argued one direction or another. It depends on the implementation. Yeah, I totally did Malygos at 70. Yeah, exactly. You do this. You have to do. Anybody who remembers, the Malygos fight was actually pretty rough. It was legitimately a rough fight. Not the first half, or even the second half, phase 1 or phase 2. No, phase 3 was a pain, because all you could do was like, okay, I have to do this, and this, and this, and this. You 3 are going to be the healer drakes. You 22 are going to be the DPS drakes. Everyone needs to move every time he puts a new thing on. We have to move as a group. Follow the triangle. It's very important. I know you can move in 3 dimensions. Don't go up or down. Just move around him in a rotation. Yes? Is there someone there? Well, come on down here and I'll do it for you. Well, I could do that too, but I can't reach it when it's up there.
I'm coming down.
Are you? I don't know. Guys, do you think she's coming down? I don't think she's coming. Well. I guess I won't open any cheese snacks for any little ones. Oh, there you are. Okay. Oh my goodness, she really tried with this. I'll tell you what, kiddo. I'm going to tell you a super mega trick for getting this to happen. If you haven't, oh god, you might have ripped it off. So there's a little bit right here. Do you see that? I know it's really hard to see, but it's meant to be peeled away like this. But it looks like it's been ripped off. So we'll try it on this end, okay? Because I want to show you how to get these in the future. Okay, so you got to separate them like this. Do you see what I'm doing here?
Yeah.
There we go. And then when you get one in each finger, you got to pull. Like this. Here, you pull the rest of the way. There you go. See? That's how you open those, okay?
Okay.
I'll help you, of course, if you need help. But you need to be able to understand how to do this yourself. No, Capri Suns. Those are the big ones. You ever had Capri Sun, kiddo? It's the juice packs. Here, no. Stop. Grab one end. Grab the other end. Keep pulling. No, pull apart. Hang on, stop. Like this. See? Much easier. It's okay. It's okay. That's the right trash can. You were good. Thingy. I don't see you. Up there. Thingy. Love you too, kiddo. What was I saying? RPG difficulty. We could talk about this all day. We could legit talk about this topic all day. There are so many different permutations, and it depends on the type of game you're going to build. Does anyone else have any specific questions you want to ask before I move on to Overwatch? This is my last topic for the day. Snap bottles. Sunny D. Sorry. Scaling. Right, you brought up scaling. Why is Divinity Original Sin 2 so hard? Actually, I can answer that one. It's so hard because player choice is through the roof. And so they have assumed a higher average in using the examples I did than other games might. That's actually the answer. It's a very simple answer. Because the amount of player choice in Divinity Original Sin 2 is through the goddamn roof. There's so much you can do. So let's talk about scaling really briefly. Believe it or not, scaling is actually a really easy thing to do once you have a system in place for it. Because scaling is all about percentages. So what you do is you decide, do everything I talked about earlier with regards to figuring out actual power output, right? I'm sorry, can I change the playlist? I love Morrowind music, but I have another playlist I want to play. There we go. So, you decide that player output, and then you decide your player output for example, level blah. And then you decide it for level blah, and then you decide it for level blah. And you just kind of figure out, and this is something WoW has actually done. They know that at level 62, this number is your overall average player power output level. The amount of average health you should have, the amount of average healing you should be able to do, and the average amount of damage you should be able to do. Now, obviously, if you're a healer, it leans one way. If you're a tank, it's the other way. But the point is, they have math for all these figures. I've actually seen some of their equations. It's wonderfully complex. So you do all the earlier stuff I mentioned about figuring that out. And so let's use Legion as the exact example. You figured out where a player should be at 98, 99, 100, 101, 102, 103, 104, 105, 199, and 110. What you then decide is you build the game, and you say, okay, I'm going to design all my trash fights and all my encounter fights, my bosses in WoW, not the dungeon stuff, but all of the regular encounters and regular bosses around the idea of level 98, which is the lowest they can be. And that's now your new baseline. Then you figure out what percent it takes to reach baseline of 98 to baseline of 99. Thus, when the enemy is scaled to 99, you just apply that percentage to their stats. Boom. Done. Now, there is a problem with this method of scaling, and that it is that level, and this is true, I know this absolutely in WoW, again, seen some of the stats, because you can tell if you don't gear up as you're leveling through Legion, you will have a harder time of it than you otherwise should. And in fact, another way to put this is, when you hit 98, if you go to Legion at 98, you're going to have a pretty rough time because you're using gear from Warlords. Or your heirlooms are scaled to Warlords levels, which is basically a different scale than Legion scale. So you'll have a harder time until you hit 100 or start getting actual Legion gear, in which case you'll be able to start catching up. Because they don't assume that you are level 98 with 98 Legion gear, with 98 overall output, if this makes any kind of sense. If you don't gear up, they will have a harder time. It's actually really simple. Now, Legion kind of bypasses this problem because gear is thrown at you like there's a freaking automatic gear machine. It's all green gear, but virtually every quest, I mean a huge number of quests in Legion, just fling gear at you, usually multiple pieces of gear, even for a single spec. It's like, here, gear. So it's not like they're not trying to keep you caught up on a gear level. Make sense? I actually don't have anything else to say about that. Whether or not scaling should be used or not is a completely different question. There are good uses of scaling, I can say this finally. But there's also very bad uses of scaling. I've been saying that for years. So, yay. Anyways, I don't actually know what else to add to that, to be completely honest with you. Hang on. Earlier, someone asked something else. How to make a game not too easy for min-maxers, but possible for casual players. There's several ways to do that. But the easiest and simplest way is to design your game so that there are tags associated with a lot of different things in the bosses, in their abilities, in the NPCs that you happen to have with, your own abilities. Basically, attach tags to all sorts of different stuff throughout the course of your game so that you can then go back and add proper difficulty options to it. So, that is the best answer to this. It's also one of the most time-consuming answers to this. See you around, Cloud of the Stars. Now, if you're saying, like, how do I make FF6... actually, FF6 is a moderately good example, but because FF6 is a game that someone can play casually and still beat. It's not super hard. It is however, if you're min-maxing, FF6 is ridiculously easy. So, what I'm trying to say is that without setting up proper difficulty options, any given game is either going to be too hard or too easy the more you stray off of that. And you as a designer have to design which direction you want to lean that towards for your specific game. Do you want this to be a game that more people can play through? Or do you want this to be a game that specifically challenges a smaller category of people, right? Yeah, super underleveled psychotic. I actually want to beat my record on that because I think I can. So yeah, exactly. You have to design your audience. You have to decide your audience, and you have to decide which direction you want to lean on that one, because that will affect those as you go through. Again, FF6 is a good example of that because they leaned on the casual side of things. By contrast, FF5 lent a little bit more kind of in the middle, but you can still min-max like crazy and crush FF5. In fact, I'm actually having a hard time off the top of my head coming up with a game that you can min-max in and not just destroy. I'm sure there is one, I just can't think of one off the top of my head. Do you have a publisher? Yeah, that'll decide the answer for you. Or rather, they will decide the answer for you. And that's true. White damage and yellow damage. I'm going to save that topic for next week, I'm not ignoring it. I just wanted to hit one today. Yeah, Final Fantasies do tend to lead more towards the casual dynamic. Most of the challenge of Final Fantasy games tends to land on the player side of things. Now, I prefer that, obviously, but that's just an opinion thing. Most of the difficulty from any given FF comes from where you want it to come from. Doing low-level runs or speed runs or single-character runs or whatever. Now, Tigsar says Dragon Quest games are harder. That's funny, because Dragon Quest games are almost universally worse designed from a gameplay perspective. Dragon Quest games, with only a couple of exceptions, have a heavy emphasis on the vertical line. Huge emphasis on the vertical line. Your gear barely matters, and you don't really have much else unless a class system happens to exist. And only some of the Dragon Quest have the classes. Let's use 8. 8's a good example. 8 is almost universally on the vertical scale with very little gear. It's basically similar to FF4. And that difficulty is pure stats. As in order to beat X boss, your average power level at this point is actually down here. So you need to go and grind. Dragon Quest games presume grinding. Now, some of the Dragon Quest games in some of the proper remakes are designed well enough so that grind is, let's just say, rewarding, which does help significantly. I will use Dragon Quest IV in the early parts, not the final chapter, but the early parts is a good example of this. If you sit and grind up and level one level in any of the earlier chapters of Dragon Quest IV, that one level is significant. So which is a whole other topic, actually. But basically, instead of doing like this increase in power level, you do like this increase in power level. Okay, that might be an exaggeration, but it's noticeable. And thus, while there is grind, it's very short and brief grind, because you only got to level once, or maybe twice. Now, that's not all the Dragon Quest games. Now, I hate to bash this one, but Dragon Quest VII is a good example of a game that leans very heavily on the go grind. Go on, shoo. Go grind, because they're stat walls. You can't just clever your way around Dragon Quest bosses in most Dragon Quest games. You have to stat your way through. Player agency is taken away from you because the only thing that determines whether or not you beat this boss is how much effort you put into leveling up before you ever reach it. Ah! Now, if you grind too much, you get filled with fear. Thank you very, very much, Wilson. Believe it or not, those Twitch Prime subs are still appreciated and still grateful. Thank you. Thank you. The Breath of Fires vary. Some people may or may not remember this. Breath of Fire 1, Breath of Fire 2, and Breath of Fire 3 were all made by a completely different developer team. I don't remember who made 4. And I know 5 was made by a different team. 6 doesn't exist. Well, yeah, exactly, Tigzar. Now, I don't want to sound like I'm bashing older games, but it is worth noting that a lot of this stat-heavy difficulty basically wasn't really difficulty, right? It was just, did you get through X in order to progress? Was that the one about the Pillars game, Wilson? Because if so, yes, I did. And I will be adding it to it. I just got that message like right before I streamed, so I haven't done anything with it yet. What was I saying? Breath of Fires. So each of the Breath of Fires varies, is what I'm trying to say. Breath of Fire 2 is a very badly balanced game in terms of its difficulty. Breath of Fire 2, in my opinion, was trying for something, but didn't actually do what the final few steps to make it work. Breath of Fire 2 was trying to make it so that every encounter was challenging, but they made leveling less rewarding, and they made the encounters too common. So it's like it's like the worst situation for me. It's the stuff I hate. It's grindy, and grinding is aggravating. Breath of Fire 1, by contrast, weirdly enough, even though it is a worse game in almost every way than 2, is a lot better balanced. Most of the difficulty in Breath of Fire 1 sits on basically specific difficulty cliffs. The curve is very linear right up until you hit this boss. And then it's very linear right up until you hit this boss, which is actually kind of like FF10 for that matter. No, that's actually true, Tigzar. I agree with you. Memorization platformers. I just mentioned that yesterday when we were going through Donkey Kong Country. A lot of the difficulty of those earlier games is just knowing what's coming rather than, reflexes or skill or adaptation or whatever. So I do agree on that, Crimson. I do agree on lowering the level cap. Let me go ahead and say what is, in my opinion, one of the best balanced JRPGs I've ever seen in my life, and that is Paper Mario 1. Now, Paper Mario 1 is a brilliantly designed game with regards to its difficulty curve and its player output curve. I keep dropping this. Because you can decide on exactly... well, we discussed all RPGs, Django. You can pretty much tell at any given point in time what level that Mario should be. You can decide based on the amount of gear you've got and what kind of output he has and what badges you have access to, and you can decide based on which partners have been available to you and whether or not you can upgrade them or not, how much output they can do. So the amount of player power output is extremely designable, deducible. You can tell almost perfectly where you should be at in Paper Mario. And they did the right thing with this. Combat is relatively quick in trash fights in Paper Mario, and you actually can't grind in Paper Mario. You literally can't. If you keep fighting to a certain point, enemies stop giving you experience. And the amount of experience enemies give the player is completely dependent on their level versus yours. So if you fight something too higher level, it gives you more than you otherwise would get. If you're fighting something at level, it gives you what it should. And if you're fighting something over level, it gives you less or none. You could see how these different points now interact to give you a perfect player output curve. You can decide almost perfectly where the player should be, and they designed the difficulty of the game exactly on that line. Even if you go through that game avoiding encounters, the bosses give you tons of experience, and any fights you don't avoid give you tons of experience to help you catch up. This is why I say Paper Mario is a brilliantly designed game when it comes to its gameplay and its leveling curve and its difficulty curve, because all of these dynamic, it's not just the stats, they designed the very nature of the game around this concept. The fact that you have that pseudo ATE, or not ATE, it's the wrong term, QTE, that pseudo QTE thing when it comes to the action turn-based combat means a player who has a skill on his side can do better, and a player who doesn't does actually have the access to get gear or equipment in order to overcome that. If someone funds it, sure, Revan, whatever. I don't know anything about it, so I'd have to look it up to 100%. I have to vet everything that is streamed. Yeah, Tigzar, that's another thing. Breath of Fire 2 in particular approaches every dungeon as if it is an endurance fight, which is a specific method of difficulty scaling, but is one that I feel they leaned a little bit too heavily on the endurance side of the equation. Because each individual dungeon is basically a marathon in Breath of Fire 2, especially if you aren't going and grinding. And even if you are going and grinding, it's still a marathon, because holy crap, that game. But that's another thing. Someone else asked questions. Hang on, let me scroll up here. Someone asked about zones. I don't understand that question. Who asked about that? Well, of course, preference has to play a part, Blue Wolf Alex. But I hope at least I have explained part, very small part, because there's so much more to explain about why I love the Paper Mario method. I got to be honest, if I was to design an RPG, I would probably lean on the Paper Mario method. The idea of one increased attack power being a big deal is something that appeals to me. I have to admit, some of that is from games like FF13. Now, I don't want to call FF13 out as a bad game. That's not what I'm trying to do. It's just an obvious example of when numbers are so inflated they lose meaning to me. Like, I feel like that's an opposite extreme, right? So I'm kind of moving away from that. It's like, I hit the boss for 382 million! And his health goes, poop. You know, I'd rather hit the boss for 1, and then his health goes, poop. Anywho. Because percentage-wise, it's actually the same thing. Yeah, welcome to Pulse, yeah. So, I still don't understand your actual question, Mandart. Like, so... Designing zones when it comes to designing gameplay difficulty it's a related topic, but it is kind of a separate topic that just happens to branch over a little bit. Because zone designing is actually very important when it comes to designing a proper RPG, otherwise you get Oblivion. We don't want Oblivion, do we? And let me explain what I mean by that. In Oblivion, wherever you are is effectively one zone. You may face different types of enemies, but the overall challenge output of any given area you're going to be at is always identical because of the way that game approaches level scaling. So there's actually really just the one zone when it comes to a game design perspective, right? By contrast, something like, I don't know, yeah, that's actually a good example as well, Takoida, Xenoblade. For example, FF6 is actually another decent example. Look, I love Oblivion, probably more than most people in chat. I'm just saying. Let's use a couple of FFs as an example here. FF2. In FF2, if you go the wrong direction, you wind up in Hell Zone. For those of you not aware, if you literally leave the first town, Altair, and you go west, and it's not even that far west, if you just go a little bit west, you end up in I'm going to kill you in the face land, because that is a much higher zone. That's how you do zones badly. Now, that being said, as much as I love FF6 to death, I can't say it does zones perfectly, because it doesn't. It does use zones, but most of those zones aren't super defined. FF6 uses zones within zones, is actually the method it uses. So there's general zones of relative power output amongst the difficulty. Almost the entire northern continent of FF6 is all one zone. You've got the super easy area, and then you've got everything else, which basically balanced around level 15 to 20. I can tell you that right now off the top of my head. Almost everything up to and around this entire region is designed around that, as far as the overworld. Now, there are subzones within that. There's the subzone between Narsh and Figaro, which is the newbie area. And there's a subzone around Kohlingen down to... is that Jidor? And then Zozo and the other thing. That area is kind of a smaller area, which is higher level, because that's the last area you're supposed to enter within that region. I actually agree with you on that, Django. Now, that's a decent way to do it. It's not perfect, but that way, basically, the player is going to be challenged relatively well based on where they're at. Now, this only really applies to World of Balance, though, because if you take the 1,000-mile view and look down at the Earth of FF6, it's like there's the northern continent zones. The Veldt is a totally separate thing. The Veldt is basically its own zone. But by its nature, the Veldt will always be up to whatever your highest is, because enemies cannot show up on the Veldt unless you have encountered them already. So no matter where you are, the Veldt is as high as you have gotten, if that makes any sense. So the Veldt, while it's different, still qualifies for this. That's Oblivion Land. Then we got that. We've got the southern continent, which is significantly higher, and then there's the Thamasa Island, which is even higher than that. And that's basically it for the World of Balance. Those 4 zones pretty much qualify the totality of the map. The totality of the map. FF6 World of Ruin, hello Mr. Darkness, is a completely different matter. A surprisingly large chunk of FF6's World of Ruin map, spoiler alert, is almost the same approach, though. The entire southern continent and the entire ground trench all the way up to South Figaro is the same zone. All of that is the same relative difficulty. But then what they start doing is they start varying it up based on how high level they expect you to be when you get the airship. This is one of the reasons why FF6 is so easy, because there is no zone other than the optional stuff that is higher than once you get the airship. Once you get to that point, everything is basically the same relative equivalent of difficulty, because they want you to be able to go anywhere at the start of that moment. So the moment you are it's actually about level 25 to 30, that level range, you can go anywhere, including Kefka's Tower, although Kefka's Tower is pretty rough, because that's zoned for endgame, obviously. But you can go almost anywhere right off the bat. The only exceptions to this are individual dungeons. Even Doma is actually still the 25 to 30 range. So that's one way to approach zones, is to make it so that there's basically an aggregate area that it's like, here you go. Now, another way to do zones is to make it a lot more obvious when you have a difficulty scale or a difficulty jump. Let me use... I mentioned FF2 as an earlier example of how to do that very wrong, because there's nothing to indicate you've entered Deathland. FF5 is more of an average way to do that, because there are certain areas in FF5 which have significantly harder enemies. They are all labeled, but none of them are... Well, only one of them is demonstrated. I'll give you a perfect example of this. When you first leave Firetown, I can't think of the name of it off the top of my head, and you're going down to the... when you're going down to the library, there's a desert in between there. That desert is a higher level zone. Now, it's a desert, it's a noticeably different area, but there's nothing really saying, here there be dragons. If you happen to enter there, I've actually known a few players who wandered through there not knowing and just flippin' died. By contrast, later on in the game, there's a point at which you have to follow this path, otherwise you end up in hell. They actually do communicate that to you that time, because then you end up with, I think, the mover enemies or something like that. But anyways, you get the point. Ravenholm in Half-Life 2, obviously there's no such thing as a level, and there's barely such a thing as player output capacity in Half-Life 2, but that is actually a good example. It's really obvious you're entering someplace that is supposed to be harder. It is well telegraphed. And I do think that is the proper way to do zones. You need to know that you're entering someplace rough. My opinion. Yeah, Great Crystal Extended. Oh my god. The other way you can do zones, of course, is to completely segregate them. Most MMOs are a good example of this. I'll use the classic World of Warcraft. When you go from Elwyn Forest to Westfall, it is amazingly obvious that you are entering a totally new zone, and therefore should expect a different thing. It's also literally got an indicator on the map that says its level range, and the enemies there you can literally select and see before you encounter them that they're higher level. So there's all sorts of indicators. That's the blatantly obvious no really method of zone. But at that point, you're effectively completely segregating your zones from each other. They might as well be completely different worlds. Now, Django mentions the ghost fence. Now, that's actually an interesting example. Because with only a couple of exceptions, nothing harder outside is inside the ghost fence. I know that sounds like a weird sentence, but I mean on the overworld within the ghost fence. You'll encounter a couple of enemy types that you generally won't see, but for the most part, you don't encounter super hard stuff in there. However, the hardest stuff in the base vanilla game of Morrowind is in the dungeons inside the ghost fence, and ergo, we once again have a nice big obvious indicator that, hey, you're going into the ghost fence. We know the ghost fence is horrible. Even if you don't know the story, if you're completely ignoring the story, there's this giant spirit wall preventing entrance into here, right? So there's still indicators to the player that, hey, this is a difficult area. And once you get in there, there's the nonstop ash storm just blowing in your face. So 2 indicators there that you're entering someplace that's going to be more challenging than the rest of the game, even if you totally ignore the story. So good design on that part. Yeah, that's another example of that Kid Viper. That woman is basically the you are no longer in the tutorial woman. A lot of RPGs have that. You're leaving the tutorial, and often it's literally an NPC that will say, there's warriors here, hard ones, or something equivalent to indicate that you are now moving on to the rest of the game. Oh, that's a whole other topic, Tigzar. I don't know if I want to get into that. That is a big topic. And I have an unpopular opinion about it, too. Yeah, we'll just leave that alone. I don't want my entire viewer base to hate me. Oh, one other approach to difficulty. I'm just going to toss this out really quick. Yeah, we could go on for this all day. This is a huge topic. I just want to mention one other thing. Almost everything I was talking about, it was specifically requested to talk about, like turn-based games or ATB game, more classic style RPGs. If you enter the realm of the ARPG, there's actually another type of difficulty that can be added to it, and it's basically avoidance. In a turn-based RPG or in a ATB style RPG, avoidance is a stat. You have the right equipment or the right talents or the right spells or buffs or whatever, that gives you avoidance. In an ARPG, avoidance is on the player hitting dodge at the right moment. So, from a difficulty perspective, avoidance has to be approached from a completely different mindset in order to design a boss fight. For example, oh yeah, you could switch a stance. It's another example of that. World of Warcraft does that. So, in an ARPG, you can make it so that, for example, a mob hits a lot harder than other mobs of the relative difficulty level that we've got right here. But this mob also has, their attack is either telegraphed, I'm going to hit you, or their attack is blockable, their attack is dodgeable, or something. You can basically make it so that this attack... Let me give you a very simple example. This is totally made up off the top of my head. Let's say you have a guy who goes, wham! And there's like this massive line of damage that goes out in a straight line from where his hand hits, right? So that hit, you can make that super hard to hit. You can basically do more damage with that than the normal difficulty curve would allow you because it is avoidable, because the player will be able to see this coming, or we'll be able to see the line of earthquake coming or whatever and be able to get the hell out of the way of it, right? And that basically allows the developer more leniency in how much they make certain things hit or how much damage they take based on these kind of effects. And yeah, Ni no Kuni 2 does this, Dark Souls does this, Kingdom Hearts does this, God of War does this, for God's sakes. A lot of games approach this with this particular mindset. Tabletop RPGs? I've actually designed several tabletop RPGs, including the Magasean rule set, which I've used and will continue to use for Primus stuff if I ever have the time to get back to that, right? But in my opinion, designing a turn-based, designing a tabletop RPG in terms of difficulty balancing is basically the exact same as designing a fully turn-based game. It is only slightly different from an ATB-based game. You still have an average power output level. You still can decide, what any given player can do at any given point in time. You can even, you actually have an availability as a GM that most video games do not have. You can pay attention to what your players are doing, and the fact that Lormum just texted me, and you could say, well, Snarg is doing like 50 damage a round. So if I can then decide how many rounds I want a specific boss to last, and then I could balance that based on how much damage they are actually pushing out. And I could decide based on how much health they have, how much a boss should do. So I can actually adjust those numbers literally on the fly if I feel like tweaking needs to be done. But most of that is, again, the exact same thing as like FFT or whatever, like Taquita says. And yeah, environmental stuff is another thing. Environmental is something that can be brought into a lot of different games, and basically all games, actually. ARPG, of course, it's a natural fit. But you could still have environmental stuff be a thing in, for example, FF6. Now, they don't, but you could. You could actually have it so that, I mean, to use another JRPG as an example, Paper Mario games tend to have environmental effects that do affect specific boss fights, like being able to hit a tree to knock nuggets onto on an enemy's head to stun him, or the audience, which can be involved. There's a lot of different things you can pull in from the literal environment around the battlefield and make that part of the combat encounter. Now that gets back into that gimmicky thing, but I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. In fact, if I had my perfect, proper remake of FF6, I would probably add environmental effects to several areas to vary up some of the trash fights, and add significant environmental effects to specific boss fights where I feel it is worth doing. My opinion, of course. And of course, it has to be an ARPG, and we gotta have more hacky slashy in FF6. I mean, that's just duh. So, I feel like I've been talking a lot. So that's RPG difficulty 101. We have covered the super baseline of this. I hope this has been an interesting topic for you guys. Yeah, we've been talking about this for an hour and 20 minutes. Yes, I know, Mom. I'll be right there. My phone's over there because Minnie Zan took it over there. I am going to go ahead and chop off the recording real quick.